Hey everyone, it's Mexie, and today's video was a suggestion from Ryan Hodgson, so shout out Ryan. And we're going to be breaking down the concept and looking at the manifestation of violence under this global, colonial, imperialist, capitalist system. So I'm going to start by differentiating between some very distinct forms of violence. The first is obvious violence, obvious, immediate, visible outbursts of violence where there is a clearly identifiable agent or agents causing harm to an identifiable person, group of people, animal, environment, or thing. Zizek calls this subjective violence because there are clearly identifiable subjects, aggressors, or victims. You can think of a violent outburst like the Baltimore riots, or riots around the G20, or Richard Spencer getting punched in the face. This is the kind of obvious, sometimes very shocking, but other times quite often banal forms of violence that get the most media coverage in our social media and mainstream media landscapes. Within this mainstream landscape, milquetoast, liberal, centrist, moderates, white moderates will often denounce any protest or social movement, even if they believe in the cause. They will denounce the movement as soon as it becomes the least bit violent, because the immediateness of that destruction of property or whatever it is jarring, takes people outside of their comfort zone, and disrupts the smooth functioning of the status quo. The status quo, of course, being assumed to be neutral and nonviolent. But is that really the case? Like the famous quote, "What is the robbing of a bank compared to the founding of a bank?" What is the violent disruption of the status quo compared to the status quo? So a number of people make the distinction between this obvious, subjective, jarring kind of violence and the more slow, pernicious violence of all the systems that subjugate us. Zizek, once again, makes the distinction between symbolic violence and systemic violence, where symbolic violence is embedded in the language we use and its forms. So in cases of incitement and of the relations of social domination reproduced through our habitual speech patterns. I usually refer to this kind of violence as discursive violence, or the slow violence that results from the way that we talk about things, the way we talk about groups of people, about events, about borders, about terrorism, about democracy, about patriotism, about poor people and what they deserve in life, which, if you're looking at my comment section, includes food and water. And while discursive violence is fascinating and significant and important, we're going to focus mainly on the difference between subjective violence and systemic violence, which is the often catastrophic consequences of the smooth functioning of our economic and political systems. I'm just going to take a second here to shout out PhilosophyTube, who did an amazing video recently also drawing on Zizek's book Violence, and he does a great job outlining the liberal communists like Bill Gates, Elon Musk, etc., philanthropists who basically, try to give meaning to the accumulation of capital by giving back, totally masking the structural relations and the violence of accumulating that capital in the first place, and how incommensurable that violence is to the amount of good done by giving that money back. Anyway, I usually refer to this kind of systemic violence as slow violence because it's slow. It's not immediately visible. It's not necessarily jarring in the same way that subjective violence might be, but it's much more pernicious, it's much more pervasive, and it's much more terrifyingly impactful in the long term than subjective violence will ever be. Rob Nixon uses this term slow violence to talk about climate change and the disproportionate impacts of environmental harms on the global poor and marginalized. As I've talked about before, the people who have contributed the least to global environmental change are the ones who are going to and who are already experiencing the worst impacts of it. Rob Nixon says, "By slow violence, I mean violence of postponed effects, so violence that typically isn't recognizable as violence because it's not spectacular. It may be seen in media terms as drama deficient." So, just to take one example, something like Agent Orange, where you have a 12-year war in Vietnam, and the casualties are framed by that public perception, but the impacts, the ongoing casualties and public health effects last for decades and generations. So I think there's something analogous going on with climate change. It's that we have the postponement of the consequences. And so what we're looking at, in effect, is a kind of intergenerational theft of the conditions of life itself. our political, economic, capitalist, colonial, imperialist system has been driving climate change and continues to throw fuel on the fire. Moneyed interests who have vested interest in keeping their money are also funding disinformation campaigns to purposely and as much as possible throw sand in our eyes. The climate crisis cannot be disentangled from the slow violence of this growth-oriented, profit-seeking capital system itself, nor from the symbolic violence of the way that we talk about these things. So what are some other forms of slow violence? Where do I begin? So Natalie, aka ContraPoints, has made an incredible video about the Baltimore riots, about the slow violence of segregation, gentrification, predatory lending, and police brutality that left people no real other option but to erupt in the kind of obvious subjective violence of the riot, which of course stole the headlines instead of the distressing, unlivable conditions facing people of color in Baltimore. Austerity politics is one of the clearest and most ruinous forms of slow violence, eroding institutions and social provisioning, making essential services cost prohibitive and inaccessible, making people choose between paying their rent, eating food, or accessing life-saving medication. That is some slow violence. Destroying unions and collective bargaining power and making work more and more precarious, outsourcing or automating jobs, terrible world trade agreements that prioritize corporate profits over social well-being, the IMF and World Bank forcing countries around the world into sustained poverty through Washington consensus policies and entire control over their budgets and what they spend on, sweatshop workers treated as completely disposable cogs in the machine, the criminalization of poverty, the overplacing and harassment of people of color who are then forced to work as slaves through inmate labor, the ongoing colonial occupation and poisoning of indigenous lands for profit, the criminalization of protest and dissent, producing more than 1.5 times the amount of food we would need to feed everybody, and yet letting people starve and wasting half of that, that is some slow violence. Privatizing property and stripping people of the means of production and forcing them to compete against one another for scraps while wealth is concentrated into fewer and fewer hands. This is systemic violence and it is horrific. Fascist violence grows out of this as well, as fascism is just capitalism in decay. It's a last-ditch attempt to hold on to patriotic values like free markets, even in the face of this global, national, regional, local, extreme violence wrought by free market ideals themselves. And yet, all of this horrific, systemic, slow violence doesn't even scratch the surface. Imperialism. All of the bloody foreign wars fought in the name of imposing neoliberal capitalism around the world for profit, for hegemony, all of the extreme subjective violence and the complete violent conditions of existence for people who were left in these disaster zones. All of this is a direct result of the smooth functioning of global capitalism. There are at least 35 countries where the US has either supported or purposely inflicted horrifying violence that violates human rights. Why? Economic shock. It is no secret anymore how many democratically elected leaders were violently overthrown by Western powers, how many right-wing death squads Western powers have supported in the name of securing capital investment and economic hegemony. We've talked about Iran before and the assassination of Mossadegh after Iran nationalized its oil industry, ending a BP monopoly that only paid Iran a 16% royalty on its oil. The US and the UK paid millions to bribe military officers and paid gangsters to unleash violence in the streets of Tehran. They finally removed Mossadegh and installed the brutal Shah regime, which inflicted many horrors on its people. In Chile, when left-leaning Allende came to power in 1970, President Nixon promised to make the economy scream through severe sanctions. Where have we heard that before? Oh, right. Any nation that tries to buck neoliberal capitalism and therefore US hegemony, where the Western powers want to plan violent regime change. Sanctions are another great example of slow systemic violence. They are an act of war. And of course, those sanctions make the economy scream, and then that economy screaming is held up as a reason why regime change is necessary. So after making the economy scream, the CIA and State Department conducted sophisticated propaganda operations there for a decade. They carried out a violent military coup and installed Pinochet, one of the most murderous dictators in history, who killed thousands of people and jailed and tortured tens of thousands more. But guess what? He was amenable to US capital interests In Indonesia, they installed Suharto, another murderous dictator, killing at least 500,000 people. The US actually provided lists of leftists, socialist, Communist Party members, and people with left-leaning tendencies to be slaughtered. Once again, anything that opposes free market capitalism must be violently put down, and it doesn't matter the destruction and the violence wrought by dictators on their own people as long as they support neoliberal capitalism. The Congo is somewhere that I wanted to focus on today because what has been happening there since colonization, basically, but also more recently due to Western imperialism, has been absolutely atrocious. And it's all because they're blessed, cursed, with 32% of the world's cobalt and other highly prized strategic minerals, strategic for global capital. In 1960, the Congolese elected their first prime minister, Patrice Lumumba, who took part in their struggle for independence. But he wasn't favored by the US or Belgian governments because he wanted to stop the colonial plunder of their resources and use them to actually benefit their own people. Of course, capital interests couldn't have that. So, the CIA and Belgian government and mercenaries conspired to assassinate him and install the bloody dictator Joseph Désiré Mobutu. Mobutu abolished elections and declared himself president in 1965 and ruled for 30 years. He killed so much of his population, killed political opponents in public hangings, and had others tortured to death. And he was taking World Bank money and just keeping it for himself. And the West still supported him. Finally, Mobutu was deposed by Laurent Kabila in 1997. Kabila was far more left-wing and wanted to nationalize industries and cancel exploitative Western mining contracts that were taking all of the wealth from the country. Unfortunately, he died soon after, and although his son was not elected, and he wasn't actually even holding any public office at the time, somehow the West supported his son to succeed him. He was young, he was impressionable, and he was willing to do whatever the US wanted, namely keep the country wide open for US interests in their mineral reserves. The country is the richest in the world in terms of incredibly valuable resources, but much of the population lives on less than $1 per day. Meanwhile, they're caught in the familiar death grip of the World Bank and the IMF, who control their budget. So they have absolutely no sovereignty, and most of the wealth from their resources goes elsewhere. So some prominent mines, 80% of the wealth that is generated goes to Canada and the US, and only 20% stays in the Congo. The Pentagon is also fueling bloody violence and conflicts on the ground between rebel groups, protests, rebellions, and just overall political turmoil. 6 million people have died in the last 15 years, half of them children under 5, and 4.5 million at least have been displaced. Children are foregoing school and dying working in extremely dangerous conditions in mines, working for those strategic minerals the US needs to maintain economic hegemony, cobalt and coltan. Why are they so strategic? According to a US policy paper in 1982, number one, because we need them to wage war. We can't make weapons without them, and we need weapons in order to hold the rest of the world at gunpoint and steal their resources and their wealth in order to keep this global economy going. Number two, economic. We can't have an economy based around planned obsolescence of cell phones and flat screen TVs if we aren't in control of all these resources in order to keep our industries churning out cheap goods. So how disturbing is that? How disturbing is all of that death and the violent conditions of existence for these children working in these mines? How can anyone justify this? This is why imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. This is the horror it drives. This is where the slow systemic violence intersects with symbolic violence and subjective violence. The slow systemic violence of the system itself drives these outbursts of subjective, horrible violence against people around the world, against innocent people. It provokes outbursts and rebellions of people who are trying to resist this. And then we do violence to all of these people and to ourselves symbolically through the way that we talk about all of this. I think this is very clear when we think about the Middle East and how capital's strategy to destabilize that entire region is also wrapped up with horrible subjective violence and also symbolic violence in terms of complete Islamophobia and ignorance The Afghanistan and Iraq wars were and continue to be just unbelievable crimes against humanity, waged on completely false pretenses, leading to so much death and destruction and ongoing misery and destitution. I also want to shout out the Eyes Left podcast run by Mike Preisner and Spencer Rapone. They are two veterans who served in these imperialist wars and who were really radicalized by their experiences there. It's really incredible to get an inside view into, inside the US war machine, so I would definitely check that out. The Pentagon is also the world's biggest polluter, using more oil per day than 175 countries combined, and it's exempt from international climate treaties. As a planet, we could have converted to renewable energy by now with the money that was spent on the Iraq war. So this is another great example of how this slow violence, slow environmental violence, slow economic violence is tied up with extreme subjective violence and symbolic violence. But what the media focuses on, what we all focus on, is the rebellions, is the resistance, are the people who are taking up arms to say, screw this, we're not doing this anymore. Those are the people who are maligned as, well, why can't they just do this peacefully? This is just so violent. I don't like that Antifa just kicked over this trash can. I don't think I can support them anymore. So pay attention to the way that violence is talked about in our mainstream media, in our mainstream discourse. Think about the symbolic violence of the way that we talk about violence in the first place, and what kind of violence is exalted, what kind of violence is invisibilized, what kind of violence is considered to be just neutral and banal and not worth anyone getting upset about, and what kind of violence is criminalized. Just look at who our allies are. Israel is murdering and imprisoning Palestinians in a brutal, illegal colonial occupation. But that's fine, that's okay in our books. Saudi Arabia, need I say more? But the ongoing brutal slaughter of Yemeni people, bombing wedding parties and school buses full of children. Sure, okay, we'll support that. We'll even sell them weapons to do it. But we really have to come down hard on Venezuela, though. That's a line that we need to really draw in the sand. It's okay for people in Palestine to have no food, no water, no housing, no electricity, to just be being murdered mercilessly for merely trying to exist. It's okay for people in the Congo. It's okay for all those children dying in the mines. It's okay. It's okay for people in Yemen. It's okay that they're all dying of cholera and we're funding people to mass murder them and their wedding parties. That's fine. But it's not okay for Venezuelans. We really, really care about what's happening to Venezuelans. We care so much about their human rights, not about their oil, not about their bucking of neoliberal capitalism, not about any of that. We just care so much about their human rights. That's why we're making their economy scream through crippling sanctions and funding violent protests in the streets. The truth is that within the slow violence of this capitalist system and the symbolic violence of the way that we talk about it, subjective, obvious, brutal violence will always be okay as long as it's in service of capital. Hell, it'll be cheered on ad nauseum. Meanwhile, the outbursts of violence for people resisting, like Black Lives Matter getting too rowdy at a protest, like Antifa punching someone in the face, that will be demonized and purged from the public sphere. Thank you from the bottom of my heart to all the patrons who support the continuation of this show. Super special shout out to Dolly and Sean, who is amazing. If you'd like to support, you can become a monthly patron or toss me a one-time donation via PayPal. Like, share, comment, subscribe, and I will see you in another video.